try to be present, if that's coming from the wrong place.
That's a great stumbling block. Mm-hmm. Of course, we hear that in spirituality, don't we? Try to be present, be in the moment. All these are phrases that are heard by the egoic mind, aren't they? So the egoic mind says, I'm going to try to be present, I'm going to try to be in the moment, which is a dismissal of the underlying reality of experience, which is every experience unfolds within the moment. So as soon as the mind decides it's going to try to be in the moment, it's just confusing itself. In a sense, it's lying to itself, because we're already in the moment. We can't possibly get out of the moment. So in one sense, being in the moment, if it's heard from the heart and not from the head, one starts to realize that there is only the moment. So there starts to be a conscious recognition that there is only the moment. There is only now. Regardless of what one is doing or thinking or saying, it's all taking place in the now. And so when the mind takes the spiritual directive to try to be in the moment, the mind has to dismiss the fact that you're actually in the moment, that there's no other place you could actually be. And then the mind tries to be in the moment, tries to be more present, which is the mind superseding, overriding the reality, which is you are the moment. You are the whole of what's happening in any instant. Form looks for security even in spirituality, thinking, I'll just get my state to be constant. Still searching for security. Trying to get the impermanence to stop moving.
Yes, and so there's an overlay on what is, or this moment when we try to be present.
There's a new assertion of me, the spiritual seeker, trying to follow out a spiritual instruction or dictate. When all it leads to is a vast amount of tail chasing, right? It actually fuels the very thing that true spirituality is trying to move beyond the limited sense of me. And yet, so often the spiritual directives actually reinforce the sense of me, the me who is actually carrying them out, the me who's trying to be present. So this is a great stumbling block that many people get stuck in for years, trying to perfect some technique, we could say. And as soon as we can look at this, see the dilemma of consciousness being fused with form and expecting happiness to come through thought form or feeling form. See the limitation of seeking security in all these ways. When we can actually see that and not look away at all from our own experience, there's a natural sort of stopping. You don't even try to stop, there's a natural stopping.
Yes, until the mind seems to become so exhausted that trying can let go.
That's one way.
That's one way.
That's the long path, is getting the mind to become so exhausted that it finally lets go. And it can and does get exhausted at some point. If one actually tries hard enough and long enough, the mind gets exhausted and then it lets go. But when it lets go, so often one opens to a deeper truth, to a truth that's not of the mind, that's a truth that's not of the seeker, right? Not of the world of becoming and progress, and all of that just stops because the mind gets exhausted, the emotional body gets exhausted, and so there's a stopping, there's an opening. But the problem becomes, because there wasn't a basic intelligence of how the mind functions, then very quickly the mind reestablishes itself and starts to wonder, how can I stay in this most beautiful state, in this most precious state? How can I do this? Which is a reestablishment, right, of the seeker, the little me, trying to maintain being in the moment, trying to maintain silence, trying to maintain something. So I call it the long path because when most people do go by the route of being exhausted, and then they open or surrender. You see, but ultimately, as long as we're hooked into that, we're actually chained to the egoic state of mind and just exhausting it, rather than from the very beginning seeing that every strategy that we try to move, even the strategy to be in the moment, is actually fueling our sense of separation. You see, so one way is the long path, which we're just following the illusion of the ego till it exhausts itself. But it'll rest, and then it'll come back. Or the direct way is starting to have a certain deep insight into the nature of mind, into the nature of egoic self, and starting to see that every way it turns to become better, free, enlightened, is itself feeding the illusion of its own separateness. And so many human beings think that this is so far away from them. It's so far away, so far in the distance. Maybe I'll realize that someday. But this is just a thought too. Sooner or later, the mind will have to face its own powerlessness. The egoic self will have to face its own powerlessness, its own impotence, in the sense of its ability to come into the truth. The egoic sense of self doesn't come into the truth. It just opens itself, sees beyond itself. All the things that the egoic mind used to negotiate through life, consciousness has none of it. It doesn't move that way. And to finally and completely open up into that is to let yourself go into emptiness. Just let go into emptiness. And then something else moves. Something that doesn't move from an idea, something that doesn't move from an ideology, something that doesn't move from a belief system, something that doesn't move from a point of view. It just moves spontaneously, without any distorting mental complex. The mind can never figure this one out.
A wisdom of the mind rather than an exhaustion of the mind. Could you talk about that?
I would say it's wisdom of awareness itself. It's the wisdom that comes from consciousness, from observation without analyzing. Because the mind's wisdom is always in the realm of analyzing what we see. And we analyze from the standpoint of our own conditioning. So our analyzing is corrupted by our own conditioning from the very beginning. This sort of wisdom that I'm talking about is a wisdom that comes directly from the seat of consciousness, from the seat of awareness, when we're just watching. So there is a watching without trying to manipulate anything, without trying to change, because that's the egoic self. It witnesses, it analyzes, it takes what it analyzes, and it tries to change itself. That's feeding the illusion. When I'm talking about wisdom, it's something much deeper. It's much more quiet. It comes from this place which is still. It comes from stillness itself. That the stillness is not dead, that it's actually aware, that stillness is conscious, and it's watching. And wisdom just comes from that watching, from that silence. And it's not analyzed. It's not used by the mind to implore or employ a better method. It's just the wisdom that just arises and blooms, and nothing's done with it, you see? Because it's not from the mind. It's from the deepest state of your own being. It's from silence. And the wisdom just blooms. and the little self is